Welcome back to Late Open Podcast. This is Charna Cassell, and this week's guests both have been on the podcast before. I think they're brilliant and engaging and interesting humans. Mark Walsh, who's the host of the Embodiment Podcast, as well as an embodiment coach and trauma trainer. And Christian Branscombe does facilitation of restorative justice with victims and offenders of violent crime, and as well as a coach who does shadow, shame, and trauma work. I promise you, it's a super engaging and interesting and unusual conversation to get to hear about experiences of working inside prison as well as in a war-torn country. So I hope you enjoy this episode and that you find it educational. Welcome, both of you.
Learn how to live embodied. Your life is about cover new tools and start healing. Leave trauma and tension behind. Isn't it great laid open? Let all your desires come true. How can you live laid open? Imagine yourself brand new. Imagine yourself brand new.
Nice to see you again, Jenna.
Yeah, good to see both of you. Today, I would really love to discuss each of your work and as it relates to the experience of vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue, which I think, post-COVID, we are saturated with, and then dealing with what's happening in the world in so many ways. It's just escalating. And yeah, how are you today? First of all, let's just start there.
I mean, for myself, I'm doing great. I've just recently, moved to a different state, and I'm kind of getting settled in. But I love the change of pace and the environment. So just glad to be here and in good company.
Well, I've mentioned I got rained on. I'm on my third pair of socks today. I'm experiencing the intense trauma of a British summer. Though I have just got back from a romantic week by Lake Como. So this is the duality of life in terms of weather reports. So yeah, a mix, but mostly pretty good.
And that sounds like a super resourcing weekend before having a conversation about compassion fatigue.
Yeah, I mean, I have good taste in Italian girlfriends and Italian food and Italian countryside. So it was tough, but someone had to, suffer that to bring the knowledge forward.
You survived. I'm so glad, because you would have been missed. So a big part of your work, for instance, Mark, has been doing training with people in the Ukraine around trauma education. And my understanding is being first responders. And so how have you seen vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue show up?
Yeah. So if you're around fucked up people, you will get fucked up. Okay. That's as simple as that. You can reduce that. You can become more aware of that. You can reduce the impact of that, and you can deal with that once it's happened. We are empathic creatures, assuming no one here is a psychopath, and I'm pretty sure we're not. And we will naturally empathize with people. And somatically, we do take on board bits of other people's body. That's the mechanism for that. So, I see you, and we're different. We're in a different time zone, different gender, different, place, but different personalities. But a little bit of me responds to you as we talk. Now, if a little bit of you is traumatized and fucked up, that's going to, technical terms, obviously I'm using the clinical terms here, that's going to impact me. And that could impact as something as simple as tension in my body. Like I've come out of trainings in Ukraine, just really sore shoulders. Like, why are my traps so tense? Like I've been in the gym all day or something. It could be weirder than that. It could be, spiritual things, emotional things. Cynicism is one I've seen a lot. It's partly cultural as well. I picked up a Jewish sense of humor working in Israel. My own Irish background kind of is part of that. And the cynicism in Ukraine is, can be part of it. That's usually one of the wide call-up. We have a system of orange flags and red flags. And it's things we do that might be, the kids talk about this in dating, right? What's an orange flag or a redhead flag? Sorry, a red flag, John. And we will say like, hey, orange flag might be I start eating a lot of sugar. So there's one for me if I'm around traumatized people. I said, oh, I'm self-medicating. I don't normally eat a lot of sugar. That's interesting. That's a little orange flag, like, be careful. And then we have the red flags, which are like, hey, if you start doing that, like, I'm a recovering alcoholic, I've been sober long term. If I start seriously considering a drink, it's time for me to get out of that environment and, cut back on what I'm doing. And then we have green flags as well, like positive things.
Well, one thing that you said, Mark, that I think is important is, what the orange flags are going to be different for each person, right? Like there might be.
I sit my trainers down and work it out. We work it out with them. What's your orange flag? Because it's someone who eats a lot of sugar normally. It's not a problem for them. It's just a part of their normality. And it can be hypo or hyper almost anything.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, I've found with some of the work that I've done, at least in the beginning, especially, I would get unknowingly overwhelmed. And then when I had to kind of like go back and go like, hold on a second here, I'm taking this home with me. I had to really reflect on, for me, there was like two aspects of it. When I had the compassion for the situation, but I was powerless, then that was me struggling with my control issues of something and really trying to reframe that in a way to understand, like, I'm not here to influence this. I'm here to, accompany this person or give them the opportunity to change their path. And for me to reframe that took a little while, because it really was about wanting to control the situation, which you can't do. And I think that that's one form of the vicarious trauma with it, where you're like, you're taking on things that aren't yours to take on. The other thing is that, sometimes I would find when they're triggered, it's hitting one of my triggers. It's like, it's a life experience that I relate to, and sometimes it's very subtle. So I end up kind of like unconsciously taking that away, and I'm focusing on them, but I'm actually working on my own stuff. Right. So like, it's like trying to find that nuance in it to where I can be self-aware enough, at least as a coach, to go, this is their stuff and this is my stuff. And then really know how to approach that properly.
Yeah. And so I would like to just jump in and make a few distinctions, and then move forward. But in terms of compassion fatigue, it's like this physical and emotional erosion over time, like a slow erosion of an inability and to refuel and regenerate yourself. And otherwise, something like secondary trauma and vicarious trauma can happen from a single incident, which I think is important. And so you're both working in you've worked in environments and situations that make more sense to me around compassion fatigue versus a singular incident, right? Look, when you're repeatedly being exposed to other people's trauma, as well as potentially your own.
And I'll add one more thing that kind of came to mind as you were talking, is that there's another layer too, when a lot of times to have an emotional impact or to get somebody else to open up emotionally, sometimes we have to tap into our emotions, right? And so we have to relive something or call something up that is emotional for us. And I think that that's another aspect to it, depending on the type of client you have. Some people want it to be sterile and kind of clean cut. Other people need to do the deep dive and really feel their way through it. I think that when you watch them feel it, vicariously, you're going through it. But then there's that, that other layer where you're, if you have to call up some of your history to trigger them, then that's another thing you might carry away from it, unintentionally.
Let's give a little context. Christian doing facilitating restorative justice between victims and offenders of violent crime, right? So just to give you a snapshot of what he's referring to in terms of, what you might be bringing up to create an experience of empathy for an offender when he's sitting with a victim, for instance.
Right. And a lot of the work that I did, especially when I was inside, was related around amends. And one of the hardest barriers to get somebody into a place of true amends is taking responsibility. That ownership of an action, when it's so consequential and irremovable, usually, you can't take it back or mitigate it in some way that's valuable enough to hit the charts. It's a very intense thing to go through. So a lot of times the person coaching is definitely going to have to take the deep dive with them, because they're in complete darkness. They're not physically aware of themselves. They're not aware of their triggers or how they actually bared responsibility in this, because they've always been projecting that onto somebody else. They've with shame, especially, it's always, they feel like they're being attacked because they're so insecure and sensitive from the trauma that they then react and think that they're defending themselves when they're actually attacking somebody. Right. So it's a very subtle thing to get that person to embody that and understand their responsibility.
Yeah. Yeah. This is another thing that interests me is, like Mark, where you were coming from in terms of experience being compelled to go to Ukraine versus Christian, you were an inmate, right? You were starting this work from the inside.
Right.
And so your beginning places in terms of like what compelled you to do the work that you're doing, it might seem straightforward, but if you'd like to speak to that.
I mean, honestly, I think if you meditate a lot, you realize you're not really conscious of your actual motivations. So when people speak about their motivations, at best, they're doing some kind of bad PR job. And we could assume most of our motivations for doing things are pretty pathological. I think if we were really honest, and, if I look back on what motivated me to do anything 10 or 20 years ago with hindsight, it's usually not quite the PR job I gave at the time. What thing that's certain with the Ukraine, I mean, I grew up around trauma and conflict, so I've always felt quite at home in trauma and conflict. I think there's also almost a mystical piece here that I always knew that I was destined for a war, and that used to confuse me because I'm not a soldier and I don't feel inclined towards learning to shoot guns and things particularly. And then the Ukraine situation happened, and my first instinct was actually to go fight. And I said, oh, okay, because I'm married to someone from Ukraine. I've been there many times. I have a lot of links there. I speak some Russian and Ukrainian. And with the full-scale invasion, because I'd already worked there for some years with the previous smaller invasions. And I spoke to a friend of mine, Alex, and he said, well, Mark, if you go fight, you're not a very good soldier and you'll probably get shot pretty quick, but you know quite a lot about trauma education, so maybe you should go teach that instead. And I thought, that's smart. Thank you, Alex. And honestly, I was definitely had that sense of, the Vikings used to call it following your weird. There's a sense of sort of life. And it's a mixture, we could look at it kind of in terms of a psychological compelling, but I think there's a bit more to it than that. There's places we're meant to be, times and places we're meant to be. And I if you look at any picture of me teaching in Ukraine, I've never looked happier. Even if I'm in a bomb shelter, cold, and got a lot of physical pain at the time because of sciatica problem, I actually just look very, very happy because I'm very, very on purpose. And I was just very well qualified, like I knew about that work, and personality wise, I'm sort of irresponsible enough to go into a fairly fresh war zone, not knowing what I'm doing, and start something useful. So, I think a mixture of qualifications and irresponsibility would be my answer.
Thank you.
Oh my gosh, that's good stuff. I know for me it was really just being unhappy with myself. I was in prisons in general is a war zone pretty much every day, as far as the volatility is always there. Whether it's pointed at you or not, you're always coping with, that psychologically and preparing for it. And you get this hypervigilant type of mindset, which is necessary in there to really, live it all. And, after about maybe 10 or 15 years in, I really realized like I had exhausted all of the, what I call shame ethics, meaning, like all of the things that I thought would fix me, or doubled down on the wrong way to do it, or just really, tore my life and other people's lives apart doing negative stuff. I really realized that like I was going to have to make actionable steps. Now I stopped being like super aggressive probably about 5 years in. Mind you, I was 19 when I got arrested. It took me a while to grow up a little bit, but once I did, I really didn't have, guidance, in that way. That wasn't a popular trend in there to be introspective and, find, some type of well-being. I'm not even sure if I knew that was possible, but, as Mark said, I started meditating. I got into Buddhism. I started really looking at psychology, philosophy, theology. I just explored what was meaningful to me and started going through that. And I think, haphazardly through that, I found that I couldn't get away from myself and that I was the problem. It took me a while to really have that epiphany, but that's what motivated me, as a person that was, given life without the possibility of parole and was going to die in prison. The one thing I had was a sense of integrity or honesty about who I was, whether that was a bad guy or a good guy to somebody else. That's not the question. Like, I lived under a standard of, well, I need to be able to look myself in the mirror, and am I being honest with myself? And that very simple narrative led me step by step to really going like, do I really feel this way? Why do I act this way? Or what am I getting out of it? And at some point I finally related to the other people in the situation. I had gone through enough of the trauma and finally connected to a few other people in a real way. And then I realized, like, oh my goodness, I'm carrying a debt is what I'm carrying. I'm carrying a sense of responsibility that I need to make amends for.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the real digging started then, as far as like, I really had to consider other people's experiences. I had to look at my impacts. I had to really step outside of the world I was in and do it for its sake alone, because there was no plus to it. Matter of fact, there were a lot of negatives for that, being honest about things that you've done that people aren't forgiving of, and where it came from, which is always ugly, so like it was a gut punch to really step into that ring. But that's what ultimately carried me to the finish line. What I think that pushed me a level above what I saw other people do was that I measured the accountability to the people I'd harmed, and that I was willing to do more for them than I really was even to do for myself. So that's what pushed me further.
Do you think that in doing the work that you're doing, like facilitating that kind of understanding for offenders and communication with victims, that someone who's had your experience is going to do a better job of it? Like, what do you think that that's an essential component in doing that work?
I think people could get there, just doing it the way I did, which took a long time because you're kind of stumbling through it and finding what you find, and there's no real clear direction. It's a lot better when you have a target you're aiming at, like, this is the clear next step. Let's be introspective and define that, and it really helps the journey be more complete and isn't so time consuming, so I wouldn't say it's proprietary to only people that have gone through it, but I would say that it instinctively, you're in tune with where that person is at and what they can handle and may not be able to handle. Now, everybody's got different thresholds, but I think that we're reading those signs very clearly from an intimate perspective of having felt them and gone through the process.
And Mark, like for both of you, do you feel like the spirituality, this kind of zoomed out perspective, was a resource for you, or for any form of protection in the work that you're doing, like to prevent vicarious trauma? Do you think that there's such a thing as what's been your experience there in terms of your direct experience of vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue, and what were the resources for you in that?
Yeah, I mean, I was training teams to do trauma first aid. So, for example, there would be a Lviv railway station where a whole bunch of refugees came in whose homes had just been blown up in the east or whatever. So, how to avoid vicarious trauma was absolutely part of the training.
Yeah.
And, that was one of the main things I was looking at, because I wanted that team to be sustainable. And then I had, 2 years of supervising that team. So we also saw what worked, what didn't work. And, sometimes it was as simple as getting the girls out. So, the women can leave the country. So they go to Cyprus or Poland for a week, and I just see their face totally change on the Zoom call. And I'd be like, oh, you're not in Ukraine, are you? They'd be like, no, I'm in Cyprus with my uncle. I'd be like, oh, cool. Why? Just giving them respite from that. Mm-hmm. And then there's this spiritual pieces. Like, we used to do 2 hours of meditation and somatic practice a day just to get everyone regulated enough to learn. Mm-hmm. So usually, like, if we're doing an 8 or a 10-hour learning day, and half of that's in a bomb shelter, so everyone's stressed, right? Now, people don't learn that well when they're that stressed. So we ended up doing other trainings in Poland because we were like, this is so much easier when you're not getting bombed. Like, because people can just are in learning mode rather than survival mode, different part of their brains lit up. So we would use, 2 hours of dance and meditation and somatic practice, lots of centering every day, just to keep people somewhere near their window of tolerance where they could learn something rather than just be surviving. So that was an essential part of the training. And, everybody walked away with a whole suite of self-regulation practices, whether it was TRE or EFT or centering, somatic practices, encouragement to do martial arts or different kinds of, I'd go to the gym most days. So I was a local EMDR trainer who would teach after lunch, Oksana, and I would just go and lift weights while she was, teaching her part of the day. That was part of my daily routine as a trainer. But there's other things, like I said, we talk a lot about well-being. I'm pretty intense with them about things like sleep. So, the team would turn up and I'll be like, right, how many hours sleep did everyone have last night? And it was like, okay, who had an air alarm? You don't count. Okay, you didn't have an air alarm. Why are you holding up 5 fingers and not 8? I'd get really strict with them about like simple physiological stuff as well. And we just developed a culture where it was really normal. We talk about our sex lives in case anyone had got like, hypo or hypersexual. I've heard some stories from all these young Ukrainian women, but their boyfriends, it's something you can't unhear. But we talk about their food, their drugs, how much they're smoking, which is really normal there, alcohol use, of course. So, we look at all these factors of healthy and unhealthy coping mechanisms, but also ritual stuff. Like they'd come out of a training and I'd supervise them and I'd be like, okay, did you wear those clothes in the training? They're like, yes. I'm like, why haven't you had a shower and changed your clothes? Like, daddy says that's not okay, so it's Trauma Daddy was my name. It sounds worse than it is. So, like give them like routines and things like the hand washing and the showering and, various practices. It's a bit of a download because there's I'm thinking of a lot of different stuff from the spiritual to the physical to the emotional, even to like, I don't know, doing stuff in pairs and debriefing properly. Like I'd like, do not do trainings on your own. They do them in pairs and afterwards they go sit in a cafe and they debrief the training and maybe vent that one participant was annoying or, let something go they need to talk about a little bit. Peer support. And there's loads more I can talk about, but not going to take all the time.
But so, I mean, that's the thing that you created very important structures because when you're in the kind of soup of trauma, which can get, one of the symptoms is this hazy brain fog and fatigue, that having things that you do repeatedly and consistently, it's like, oh, when you're actually in it and you're out of your window, you're more likely, if you've repeated something, to draw on it, right? To have it, once it's more embodied, it's like, oh, okay, that's a resource that I can kind of remember. Right.
Yeah, I mean, and also it's very normalized to talk about nervous system health. Like Stephen Porges actually supported the project and, zoomed in, and I had some training with him and Deb Stainer a little bit. And, became very normalized to sort of discuss the state of people's nervous systems. As you say, yes, there's regular practices. And then also the outside person, because things get normalized, like certain kinds of humor or certain types of jokes. And then, we'd have a call with an outside person. It'd be like, we've all gotten fucked up. We've got these really dark senses of humor, or we've normalized this thing we're talking about, and like, oh, okay, there's a normal person here, and then they feel different, and talk about behaviors. So, I mean, in some ways, it's quite good that I was supervising from out of the country as well, because I wasn't in the same soup. A lot of the time, I'd be on calls with them, and my job was just cheering them up. It'd just be a little bit of mood regulation, up regulation, or I'd listen to them. Talk about their mum they've just had an argument with, just, basic stuff that they need a bit of support with. Normal people, because they're young women, so they've got boyfriend problems and mum problems and, stuff like that. But yeah, the practices are definitely a key part of it.
And so, Christian, for you, without that kind of infrastructure, I'm curious what is self-preservation, self-care look like? Like, what are you doing for yourself? What are you teaching the people inside this program?
Well, it's kind of interesting because as Mark was talking about some of the experiences there, I was relating it to where we found those things inside, which, they put you on really long lockdowns in prison, so you might stay in a 10 by 3 foot cell with 2 beds, a desk. And I mean, you have shoulder width is about the length of the floor space in between that and the toilet. For a year, you might be in there for a year straight. The food comes to the door, you bathed in your house, like you live in that box for a year, with another human being, so it's, I've seen people lose their mind under those conditions. The isolation, especially if they're by themselves, can be, very traumatizing for some people. And I remember when I first came in, some of the older guys educated me. They're like, look, routines are what are going to save you in here. And he says, when you go through your first big lockdown, you're going to see people come out and they're not the same. And after you go through 3 or 4 of those, you might not be here anymore. So where suicide's a big prevalent thing in prison, and, people that just get psychotic and lose their mind and take it out on other people, and mental illness in general is a big thing in there. I learned very early that, I had to get up and I had to do 3 major things. I had to take care of my body, work out, eat clean. I had to take care of my mind and keep it engaged with new things coming in. I had to stimulate it with thought and actions, and that I had to have things that were frivolous, things that were introspective and kind of what I call spirituality, which is like really doing an inventory of yourself, meditating, finding out where you're at and what you're thinking and feeling on a deeper level. So when I would coach people in there, a lot of times spiritual things are very traumatizing. A lot of people have been traumatized through religion.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of us end up doing what we call a spiritual path versus taking on a religion, only because there's so much trauma in a lot of religions, right? And it can be triggering when you're processing somebody. So I would coach it in, I would try to reframe it to them that kind of like a koan is for a Zen Buddhist, right? Like the thing that you're facing right now is a koan that's going to allow you to become more enlightened. It's going to liberate you. It's a challenge because this has entered your life. And when you overcome this, you become the person you want to be or you're meant to be, right? So it's a journey. It's a quest, and when you reframe it in that context, it's not that you're a damaged person or that you're not normal or you're not broken. You're somebody that's trying to find their true self, and that this is the most honest endeavor you can take in your life is this introspective journey. Because if you can't be honest with yourself, how could you ever be honest with somebody else or really have true insight, right? So for me, that's the way I approach my whole practice is I try to get people to be honest with themselves, allow them the liberty, the freedom. So many people they're not free. They're living with their grandma's voice or their mom's voice or their dad's voice, or, like they're under another narrative inside of that head of theirs. We don't speak negative to ourselves. I don't know if people really get that, but like, if there's a negative narrative in your head, it's not yours.
Right.
No child goes, I don't need milk, or I shouldn't be cleaned up, or like they cry for help, like give it to me. I need this. We learn that we're undeserving, or it's demonstrated that we're undeserving, or that we feel undeserving. Right. So those narratives or those things that we carry are oftentimes things that we have to name and readdress, in the sense of like, well, this is my voice and this is that voice. So now we're going to shut that one up or give it less credibility, right? Or strengthen the voice that I never had, or whatever it is, you have to reframe it. So a lot of my work is really around that. And that's why it's shadow work, because it's more about perceptions. It doesn't even have to be a real thing out in the real world, because it's absolutely real for you if you've embodied it and are demonstrating it to yourself on a daily basis.
Right. Right. What role do you think self-awareness and self-compassion play in preventing compassion fatigue or vicarious trauma?
I think not pushing people out. I think there's this balance between finding, a place outside of their comfort zone, because you have to be outside of your comfort zone. But much like Mark was describing, creating what somebody that's usually in a state of trauma never thinks of, which is networking, having outside criticism or support, like taking, like thinking of it as a group effort, right? Because once we have shame or isolate ourselves, it's like, well, I don't trust anybody. I only trust myself. That's the first narrative of like, you're fucked, right? It's like, okay, I have to do this by myself, and nobody else is really trustworthy enough to go on this journey with me. Well, that's what the journey's about. So I always challenge them to like, tiptoe into that space. Don't trust somebody completely, give them a little trust, or do this, like reframe that narrative for yourself and see how you're contributing to it. A lot of times we pick people that are going to betray us, or we habitually do the things that hurt us, right? So we're role playing it so that we can fix it, but we just keep repeating it versus adding on to it, right? So it's like, okay, so now we're going to play it out, but this time we're going to have a different ending, right?
Well, and I also think about, in terms of being able to identify what is your orange flag, or where, am I overwhelmed? if you don't have that ability, if you hadn't trained in self-reflection and going inside, if you're having to be so vigilant that all you're doing is tracking what's happening outside of you, how do you know if you're starting to erode internally, and break down?
It's really true. And it's hard to intimate that to somebody else because they're so guarded that they can't even allow your feedback in. They're buttoned up tight as they can get, and so a lot of the times I eventually stopped just offering things to people because two things would happen is that they would feel intimidated because you saw into something they thought they were hiding. So that actually makes them more defensive. It's not helpful to be insightful sometimes. And secondly, if they aren't asking, they're actually not listening. So like if they don't ask you for the help or they don't ask you for this direction, you're really not on the inside of that idea.
Right.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, self-awareness is key, right? So few aspects, like this is psychodynamic aspect, like am I going to rescuer mode, kind of victim triangle stuff, obviously basic stuff for therapists, but like most aid workers, I've trained a lot of the major NGOs in the UK, the what would you call them, non-governmental humanitarian organizations. And someone wrote a book called Misfits, Mercenaries and Missionaries. We'd act that out in kind of fun ways, like being like a hero mark going to Ukraine to help, they sort of, act out and kind of, so it's play with it in a kind of fun way. So when you slipped into that mode, you'd notice. I mean, just somatically though, a lot of people will have all these kind of slightly esoteric models of energy and stuff like that. But the actual key thing is to have enough body awareness training that you've got residual attention for body awareness while talking to someone. So I can talk to you guys, I can speak relatively coherently and feel my ass on the chair at the same time, right? Which from the point of view of sort of centering, self-regulation is helpful, but it's also, is my body unconsciously starting to take on things, whether it be fight or flight, freeze, collapse, the basic responses, or very personalized bits of other people? Because that's me doing that. That's my muscular system. There isn't this thing reaching into me doing it. I mean, you can look at it through the lens of, demons and spirits and Greek gods, and that actually can be very helpful. Saints, we had nuns on our trainings. I'm friends with a convent of nuns in Lviv now. I'm talking to one of them tomorrow, actually, which is hilarious for me. But there's various models you can use, but I used to go in there and eat pizza with them, and the sort of young nun one used to seeing young men would scuttle around giggling. It was quite funny. But I think the somatic model is one of the most helpful. Very practical. It's like, is my body taking on the shape of someone who's traumatized? And that for me is the basic, because if you can stop that, you won't really have a problem.
In my experience of sitting with individuals or couples is also, I mean, it can even get complicated with two people in the room, right? Like I experience things very viscerally and kinesthetically and get information that way. So it means I have to know what my body and my experience internally feels like. What's my baseline? What's my state before I've entered the space? And then suddenly, if I'm extremely fatigued, extremely grief struck, like I suddenly feel like I can't contain the amount of grief, my client could be laughing, but I'm suddenly feeling incredible grief. It's like, well, wait a second. Am I feeling what's theirs to feel as they tell a story about some, horrible thing, but they're laughing about it, right? And so in a room of people, I'm picturing there's a lot happening in that space, and suddenly it's like, okay, so what's mine? What's theirs? That's
a good question. I used to teach the girls that. It's like, is this yours? Like, is this mine? Is this physicality? Is this emotion? Like, because usually you go, oh, no. And then you can begin the process of letting it go, right? And various somatic techniques for that.
Right. Yeah, naming it. I have found over time, I'm just very explicit, and I go, suddenly I'm feeling this thing, and you're laughing, yet you're telling me a story about, being beaten as a child, and I'm curious about that. And then as soon as I name it, it leaves my body, and then usually that the person suddenly is able to claim it as theirs and like emote or express it as been my repeated experience. Christian, was there something you wanted to add?
No, I agree with you. I think that that's the process. That's the way it goes.
Just as an
And
aside, your prison
yeah.
system horrifies me, by the way. Absolutely terrified. I'd much rather be in Ukraine than an American jail.
Mm.
Like, absolutely terrifies me every time I hear about your prison system.
Well, it's I'm grateful to be outside of it. I'm a fortunate man. The worst thing you can do in there is grow up, let me tell you, because for about 10 of those years, I was like, I do not agree or believe in this environment anymore, and I can't get out of it, so it was it's kind of weird how much environment dictates a lot of the things that you really do have to cope with, and so it's a privilege to be able to be out, walk away from problems, or just be a decent human being is a pleasure and a privilege, really.
Yeah, I was struck, Mark, as you were sharing the range of resources, right, in comparison to what Christian, like what you're up against in there, and even it's the amount of freedom, Mark, that you had to get to do all these different things, right, to take care of yourself and to train people to take care of themselves. And Christian, I'm wondering about, as we have learned over the years around how trauma lives in the body and how even repeating a narrative can activate the nervous system and trigger a trauma response. Curious how you've used that in the work that you've done, because I'm picturing like even having victims listen to or have to repeat their narrative. Like, how do you know when something is not restorative justice and it starts to leak into re-traumatization?
Well, to me, it's pretty simple. When something is traumatizing, it's not moving forward. So to me, moving forward is a reframe or a different feeling that's positive towards the goal that we have, or there's an action associated with it outside of themselves. I always see a psychological shift when we're actually getting some traction is the first time they ask me, which usually, frankly, takes a while. Well, what about this other person? Like they actually consider somebody outside of their own experience is a really big moment in that process to me. So I think that a lot of it really is just breaking down those barriers with the person. And the biggest thing that's hard to develop in there is a sense of safety, because it's a very judgmental place. If somebody's done something that's distasteful to our standards on the inside, well, you could get killed for real. Like, it's not an idea, like it's not public sentiment or, oh, people are going to cuss me out. I mean, they're going to come stab your ass, and you're not going to see it coming, so there's this stress that's associated with being honest and the saying like, oh, I did this awful thing. Well, if that's not acceptable, well, then that gets locked in. About towards the end of my journey in there, I really had a big epiphany about sexual trauma because obviously, a lot of us have been sexually traumatized. We tend to take that out on dudes in there that did traumatize others, and it's something that I had to really reframe, because when I realized how essential and the process of addressing shame and how all-inclusive it is and just how potent it is psychologically for us to carry this and how we process it, meaning how we re-traumatize. I realized that I felt that society holds one of the biggest standards for pedophiles and rapists because we don't want to hear their trauma. We don't want to process it, and if we can't address it, it can't change.
That's right.
So there is this, and that is a lot of the work I feel that I do with people, because I can truly be non-judgmental with somebody and say, like, you can give me your ugliest stuff. I'm in a true coach's stance right now. There's no judgment. We're just looking at how we're going to get you to the human we know you could be, right? So like, I'm looking at their potential versus how traumatized they were, right? And so that narrative has to be addressed. It has to be focused on. So a safe place or a safe, the way that I breed that in them and there is, I would say, nobody's in your head. Only people can know what you share outside of it. So if you can't be honest with yourself, then we can't do any of this. And I said, you don't have to share it with me. You never have to write it down, but you have to know it. So when I ask you, where did this come from or what did you do? It needs to be up there. And I found personally that anything that's in there is going to come out. Once they realize that there's no judgment or you share something equally vulnerable, like they have the opportunity to really get that out of their system. And ideas change us. And I can only give one example that's powerful enough to really intimate how I really see how dynamic it is that when people had life without the possibility of parole and they got commuted, which is a very, very rare thing historically. It's never happened until Jerry Brown did it. I was one of 100 that got it. It was a huge deal. Hasn't, it's probably never going to be that way. So you could see physically they're still in prison. They still have another year before they even have a chance to go home. They got to go to the board and all this other stuff. Their body, their mind, every aspect of their existence changed with one idea shifting. No physical change. It's so powerful. Our ideas are so powerful, and like how they really do trigger a physical response and how we relate to the world.
Thank you. What I saw you nodding and reflecting, Mark. What are you chewing on?
It's listening. It's a powerful story. And
Yeah.
On, what is reality, right? So someone's in a cage.
Mm-hmm.
An animal caught in a trap will tear its own leg off to get out of the trap, right? So there's that urge to be free is pretty powerful. I get that with my own cultural background, and personally, it's a big fear for me to be locked up, I tell you. And then the shift of a thing that isn't real in inverted commas, right? Like just being told, hey, you might get out of here, right? There's a way in which we live in this very real set of possibilities. So for example, just take the Ukrainians, I'll extend their time frame. Mm-hmm. So I'll say, hey, we're going to have a fucking cool dance party in Kiev after the war. And what are you going to wear? And it's like, all of a sudden it's like, their sense of possibility is so different than they're just thinking, because trauma tends to kind of make people very short-term focused. So yeah, just thinking about that, I'm going to have to mull that on. It's a really great example, actually, of how something which is at some level not real is very, very tangible.
And concept. So imagine it's your self-perception of yourself. You go, I'm not lovable. No one will love me. I'm not valuable. Like, you might not put it in those words, but these are the feelings you have. If that idea changes in a real way, nothing outside you has changed. No other things are really changing. But if that shifts, your life shifts. Everything in you shifts. You have the potential for it, even if it's not there. And I'm just saying those ideas can be very impactful. And that's a lot of times what I would focus on in there, because one thing you don't have in prison is control or anonymity or autonomy. You might look at something through a fence you'll never touch ever in your life for 30 years. It's just, it's a weird thing. You live on a football field and sometimes you get stuck in a box for long periods of time. And that's the way it is.
And inside of that, like the moments where no matter what good work you're doing, no matter how much hope you have, that compels you to believe that people can change on a individual or systemic level. Like, I'm looking at your Obama poster behind you, right? And it says change. And I felt really moved, Mark, as you were using that example of, it's like, what are you going to wear in this future moment? So that part of what helps us get through these hard times is the hope for a different possibility, or having our perspective. We're like in the present moment, but we're also have our eyes and our minds in the future of what could be. Because otherwise, if we're just stuck in this present moment and that's all we experience, there can be this level of defeat and powerlessness. And so I'm curious, in the moments of defeat and powerlessness, how have you helped others that are moving through that state, or also yourself, where you go like, there is no point to what I'm doing and this can't change?
Well, that's my starting point. My starting point, no point. So you might as well have a good time. You might as well do your thing, right? Like there's no point. I mean, like this is a sort of Nietzschean nihilistic surrender is not a bad starting point. And there's a few options there, right? Like, what did you get in the past? Like, I remember saying, during COVID, saying, this isn't unprecedented. Like, read more history. There's plenty of plagues we've been through. Or saying to a young man, he's like, I'll never get a girlfriend. I'm like, every single one of your ancestors got laid at least once. Right? Like, fact. So it's like you can go to the past or you can go to detail, right? Like, I remember being really worried during the Ukraine project and stressing. And then I was like, okay, what am I doing right now? I'm having sushi with 5 beautiful women who respect me. I was like, this could be a lot worse. This is my lunch break, with the team. And just to be clear, nothing was going with the team, but it was, still a pleasant aesthetic experience, let's say, to be having sushi with these people. And so I think you can go mindful, you can go much more into the moment. And then also you can, extend the futures, like all of those are viable. But I mean, I've been through waves of grief and grief process, and I certainly don't think it's healthy to try and get rid of grief. Like Christian's lost half his life in a fucking cage. Like there's like grief there, right? It's like we've all had grief, like these things that we can't get back, and you can't make it okay. I got sent a picture yesterday of a man whose entire family has just been killed in Lviv. It's like 3 daughters, his wife, and he's the only survivor. And, I'm talking to the nuns who are talking to him, and there's nothing you can say. Like, there is no CBT technique to reframe the loss of your 3 daughters and your wife. There's nothing, right? There's just sitting with someone, maybe. And maybe the nuns will offer him some kind of faith-based thing that might be very helpful. Maybe he doesn't believe and that's not available. Yeah. We also make time for a good time, like have dance parties on trauma trainings. Like, I'm easily the most fun trauma trainer out there. Like most of my trauma trainings are mostly like 80% stand-up comedy. Like that's particularly with the Ukrainians, they love it. And, the Ukrainian girls, they're working in groups of soldiers, and the stuff they say is fantastic. One walks in, 200 soldiers, right? And they're looking at her like, who the hell is this young girl? We've been told to be here by the officers. We'd rather be down the pub kind of thing. We're having a day off. We want to be in a bar. And she walks in and says, hey, would you guys like to fuck your wives again in the future? And they're like, what? And she's like, well, there's something called trauma that causes sexual dysfunction. So do you want to pay attention and learn about that? They're like, yes, ma'am. They've taken forward that like cheeky, like, you're not going to get that at a trauma workshop in Northern California, So I feel like humor, it's very Irish. My teacher's Jewish and I'm Irish. That's a big part of it. And making time for a good time, as well as just admitting sometimes it's too bad. But the Bhagavad Gita, the basic thing, it doesn't matter if you're winning or losing. It's your job to fight. Like, it's your job to show up and do your thing, right? That's your my Indian colleagues would just say that's your karma. That's what you do. And I think that fatalism is actually quite beautiful.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting as you describe that. It reminds me that that's the way I see trauma in general, is that I simplify it down to an idea that hasn't been contradicted so far, which is trauma is a sense of disconnection, and purpose and well-being is a sense of interconnection, and all systems of enlightenment or things that actually bring people to a place of well-being, have those tenets involved with it, right? And I recently read a biologist book named Determined by Robert Sapolsky, and it was a really powerful narrative about free will, whether we have it or not, and this determined state that he believes things are in. And when you at least explore the idea, I don't know where people would fall on that side. It's a controversial subject. I will say exploring that idea gives you kind of a very Zen approach to looking at life, that everything is exactly where it's supposed to be, and it's going to go where it's supposed to go. It's whether or not you're okay with it. It's really the bottom line. Your potential is your potential. You're going to play it out the way you play it out. There's really no other option to do than that. But along the way, are you going to resist and struggle and be exhausted and overwhelmed and feel disconnected when you still are intimately connected to all things, whether you like it or not? It's like, can you sit in that space and be okay with it? And a lot of times when you're traumatized, you want to separate from everything. So the closer you get to the center, the closer you get to that person next to you or your environment or that self-awareness, the more it's a place of well-being and purpose. And I believe it's an insightful state. I believe it's a form of enlightenment to be able to be okay with whatever's happening as is,
Yeah, right. To be with your experience rather than push it away or try to run away from it. Yeah.
It's nice. But I like the connection side of things. We had a British journalist, Johan Hari, who wrote Lost Connections. He breaks down to like 12 connections that are kind of lost in modernity. And we always used to break it down to 4. We used to say little things they remember it. You have to give, like, in a war zone, you have to give stuff like kids games so people remember stuff. So we used to say self-connection or self-regulation, co-regulation, eco-regulation. We're big on doing stuff in nature, and theo-regulation, regulation through meaning or spirituality. And that little mantra of those 4, and I was used to say to girls, if one isn't working, try one of the other 3. Like right now, I'm going to go for a walk out in nature because we've been talking about heavy shit and I want to just, decompress. So it's like, I just go walk by the road. That's eco-regulation. But then I'm having dinner with a friend. That's co-regulation. And I've got weights and meditation practice. That's self-regulation, right? Regulation, the big, like talking about Christian's beautiful words on acceptance and deep acceptance of what is, that's a spiritual practice, essentially. So like they're all effective, and my practical advice for the girls is, one wasn't working, just go one of the other 3.
Yeah. And one of the things that listeners who are not watching this on YouTube can't see is what Mark did was there were physical gestures that went with each of those, forms of regulation. And I think that's a really important thing because it helps you embody it and it helps you remember it, right? And so
you also can't see Christian's Donald Trump poster.
You'll never see one of those in my ever. Let's be burning.
I'm just fucking with you guys. I'm just fucking with you. Sorry,
it's a great fire starter. I start every fire with a Trump poster. I mean, it helps. It really does.
What's my form of resilience? Well, I have this practice every night. We roast marshmallows over a Donald Trump post.
New liberals, you're going to be the death of America.
I definitely wouldn't be considered conventional, but I am effective and I believe in what works, so to me, that's reality.
Oh, nice to meet you, by the way, man. And Chana, always a pleasure.
Yeah, it's always good.
We covered so many beautiful practices very briefly. Is there anything else around preventing or identifying compassion fatigue or vicarious trauma that either of you would like to add?
I'd say when you don't have a normal empathic human response, it's time to go home or go to your therapist. Like, I remember I was in Ethiopia and I walked over the body of a child on my way to breakfast, and then I went and ate breakfast. And then I walked back from breakfast and I saw the kid and I was, oh shit, okay, the kid's not dead, that's good. But the fact that I didn't have a response and I was just able to go eat my breakfast, that was like time to go home. Like, because I don't want to turn into that guy. Like when it doesn't hurt is the thing. Yeah, when it becomes nothing or cynical or funny, So that's one I'd add.
Yeah, that's a great example of connection. It's trauma because you feel disconnected. It's traumatizing if you feel disconnected. When you feel connected, then you're in a good, centered, healed space. So that is damaging to you if you feel disconnected. That's a great example of that.
Exactly. This is, I know, one of the questions that we didn't get to. It's like, how do you stay grounded and boundaried in this work? And I mean, maybe we can answer that before we say goodbye.
I know for me, what keeps me grounded is that I'm deeply curious and fascinated and driven by how different and similar everybody's life experience is. It's like the all paths leads to Rome type thing, but the journey there is truly amazing. And seeing the varieties of life and the varieties of people's, introspections, and just remaining like almost like a child that have to remind myself that I don't know the answers. No matter how much I think I do, the answers are going to be given to me in that moment of exploration. And when I can embody that, it feels like, a great quest, or the golden fleece, you're chasing that idea or this new thing, or, you're learning about things versus trying to dictate them. And I think for me, that's my greatest coping skill and all of this. And that helps me stay connected to the people I'm working with and realize that, these things I get the privilege of being a part of this journey because I'm not going to give up on them. And then on the other side of it, being able to also be a part of their success, so there's a joy in that.
Thank you.
Cool. Nice to meet you. Yeah, the types of self-care that people don't talk about. Financial self-care. Like, I almost went broke doing the UK project, and that almost put a lot of people out of work in my company. I ended up £500,000 in debt at one point. Not anymore, thankfully, we worked it out. but it's financial self-care. People don't talk about that nearly enough. And telling people to go fuck themselves, really important life skill, like boundaries and being able to firmly enforce them. The third one is just, this sounds so mundane, but it's most of it is your diary. Like, there's only so many calls to Ukraine I can do a week, right? There's only so many client calls or groups with prisoners or whatever it is, right? Like, most of my diary is nice stuff I enjoy. And it sounds silly, but like, you want to show me someone's values, show me their diary and their bank account. I'll tell you their values. And I think it's the same with self-care. Like, I'll tell you how good their self-care is if you show me their bank account and their diary.
Beautiful. Agreed.
Interesting.
And how can people find both of you if they want to learn more about your work or reach out?
You can find me through my name, christianbranscombe.com, or barebonescoaching.com. So either one of those you can get a hold of me, and I'd love to hear from you.
I'm available through Tinder, Bumble, and Grindr, apparently, which surprised me. So, no, I mean, if you just put Mark Walsh embodiment into the internet, I come back with books and podcasts and websites and all the rest of it.
Thank you so much. So good to see both of you, and I look forward to future conversations. Thanks for joining us. If you appreciated the episode, please like, rate, and review it and share it with your friends. And if you'd like to stay connected, you can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Laid Open Podcast, which is LAIDPODCAST, all one word. As well as if you go to charnacassell.com, you can join my newsletter where you'll get additional information and stay connected around upcoming offerings and courses. You'll also get discount codes and additional resources in my newsletter. And if you go to passionatelife.org, you can get additional information about my private practice. This has been Laid Open Podcast, and I'm your host, Charna Cassell. We all have different capacities, but I believe in our capacity to grow and change together. Until next time.